Hey all, here at OS Reviews. Today we are revisiting the iPhone X here in 2022, discussing whether it's still a worthwhile smartphone that you can consider picking up for a relatively reduced price now that the phone is almost 5 years old, released back in 2017. In some regards, such as the design, I think the iPhone X has held up quite well, at least by Apple standards, because they're still using notches such as the iPhone 13 series, so it still is resembling the latest iPhones that you can pick up right now. Swiping from the right side, bringing up the control center versus the left side, bringing up the notifications. It's something that Apple has embraced, all in pursuit of a device that gives us a higher screen to body ratio. And really, aside from that cutout, it does truly still look like a very modern phone thanks to the minimalistic chins in the left and right sides that was introduced with this 10th anniversary product. The iPhone X also introduced gestures for the very first time on iOS, but they are very intuitive. It's not that big of a learning curve, to be honest, but if you've never used a full-screen phone, it may take still a moment or two to acclimate compared to devices that have a physical home button. So essentially from the bottom bezel, you can just swipe up to take a look at all of your currently open apps like cards, easily tap to go into them, or if you have multiple apps which are open, you can shuffle between those just by jumping left and right, flick to get rid of a card, and it just clears out of the system's RAM. Now, perhaps the biggest difference between the iPhone X and some of the newer iPhones would have to be the size, because this is still a relatively compact phone. It has a 5.8-inch higher than 1080p or Super Retina display, as Apple calls it, but it really is similar to 4.7-inch iPhone, one of the classic iPhones, so it fits almost in the same dimensions in terms of the overall form factor, and as such, it still makes the device pretty easy to grip and reach everything with one hand. Later iPhones started to adopt screen sizes that are now over 6 inches. Granted, it still is definitely larger compared to the iPhones in even earlier generations, such as the iconic first iPhone with that 3.5-inch screen. You can really tell the difference there between the two, though it is always neat to see how Apple recycles part of their design through the generations, such as the first iPhone came with the aluminum back, and then later on with the iPhone 4 series, it was kind of the first time they introduced a stainless steel band coupled with glass on both the front and on the rear. But then later on, Apple went back to aluminum with the iPhone 6, for example, before now going back to glass once again. The iPhone X, though, does take advantage of the glass sandwich by incorporating wireless charging, and it is also an IP67 rated smartphone. Resist official rain, as well as splashes and dust, and of course it is still a fingerprint magnet, though, on the rear. It came with 2 editions, this black version and also a white edition, and otherwise the rear here also housed the dual camera array, which were both 12 megapixels optically stabilized, and we did have a primary lens along with a telephoto 2x optical zoom lens. The camera bump there, again, does protrude a bit from the back of the phone, so if you set it down, it does wobble a little bit, but it's nothing that a case can't solve just by adding a little bit more thickness. It usually makes everything completely flat, which you'll probably want since it is a very slippery phone. All these rounded corners compared to the sharper edges of the newer iPhones feels kind of like a pebble as you're holding it. Again, the rim here is constructed out of stainless steel, which is a bit more tough than aluminum, and otherwise it's super shiny, housing the oversized power key, which I really can't stress enough how surprised at the size I was when I first picked up this phone. I mean, it's almost 2 times larger than on previous gen phones, so it makes it really easy to hit. All the keys do feel pretty tactile and responsive, as they should, and there's just a SIM card slot at the bottom housing the lightning port along with one of the speakers. The second speaker also comes through the earpiece, so it gives you that stereo effect. The built-in speakers are a pretty big boost compared to, say, the iPhone 6s, and it just sounds a lot more rich and full. Granted, you're also missing a 3.5mm headphone jack, but on the other end, we did have access to a volume rocker and also the mute switch, which remains a staple on iPhones that is quite thoughtful, something that on the Android side, we really only have one plus, which is incorporating. So you can easily toggle into a silent mode if you're in meetings, for instance, at a flick of a key. If you're considering an iPhone X in these days, you are probably doing so because of the price. When the phone first came out, it was kind of a commemorative edition that, again, was celebrating iPhone hitting 10 years old, and it sold at a very hefty $1,000, which sadly is also a price point that has become normalized after the iPhone X. prices have never quite gone down on flagships ever since, and they're still climbing, which is crazy. However, these days an iPhone 10 can be found on a used market for under $300, sometimes as low as $200, and that definitely puts it into a much more attractive mid-end range, if not getting into budget territory. Granted, we are looking at older hardware, but like I said, in terms of the essentials, as well as looking pretty good for a compact phone, those definitely are areas that the phone still ticks. So speaking of on the front here, we do have that beautiful OLED display, also a first for an iPhone, and also made the thin bezels on here possible. Ironically, this display was made by Samsung, although it is a beautiful screen and super high quality. Colors pop because of the OLED nature. You get this super nice contrast when looking at darker text. Everything is truly black, and overall it's just a super saturated, vivid, and gorgeous screen, which even today looks amazing. Particularly on a smaller size, you get over 430 pixels per inch. There is a True Tone technology built on in, which is essentially using the light sensor to pick up your surroundings and try to adjust the overall color saturation, the temperature of the display to try and match, and even preserves 3D touch, which is unfortunately a feature that we just no longer have, but the phone can sense how hard you're pressing, and using that sensor, you can activate certain quick launch commands. Certain games also took advantage of this pressure-sensitive technology. Now, this really big notch does house the 3D sensors, which is using infrared to create a map of your face when you're unlocking it using Face ID, and it's not as fast as Touch ID, to be completely honest, but accuracy is at least quite good, and it does work in the dark as well because it's projecting these infrared lights onto you. You just have to wait a split second, kind of look at the phone, and then it just unlocks. Other specs of the phone here include a Apple A11 Bionic chipset, which is a hexa-core processor clocked up to 2.4 gigahertz. And to be completely honest, this was a super capable flagship chip at the time, especially on Apple's well-optimized OS. Everything still feels quite smooth and responsive. Of course, if you're talking about a face-off between the latest phone next to it, those phones will probably load things just a split second quicker, but in terms of general day-to-day usage, I'm not noticing really any lags or delays. All the animation certainly still feels smooth, and nothing gets frustrating to use, which is hard to say of many phones that have reached the 5-year-old mark, and that is one area where, again, I think this chipset has held up quite well. Now, granted, it does get slightly warm if you're pressing it really hard, such as doing a bit of gaming, as well as when you're setting up the phone or installing a lot of updates. One limiting thing about the iPhone 10 though might be the RAM, which at 3 gigabytes is starting to show its age a little bit, in the sense that you can't have a million programs open in the background and still expect it to flawlessly kind of jump between them at all times. If you keep, let's say, under 10 apps open, it still remains pretty fluid and quick to load, but it never hurts to have, let's say, 4 gigs of RAM and beyond for the later iPhones, which can do even more powerful multitasking. It's still running on the latest version of iOS, and it's expected to do so for at least 2 years, if not longer, so you do still have some longevity out of this phone that you can expect. For context, the iPhone 6s as of 2022 is still fully up to date with iOS version 15, so again, the iPhone 10, which came out 2 generations later, will continue to receive updates for at least those 2 more years, which is pretty crazy considering a lot of new Android phones only receive 2 years of software support, and that means the iPhone 10 at the end of life will get 7 years of support, if not a little bit longer, and that really is one area where Apple has shined, and hopefully more Android manufacturers can continue to improve. Battery life of the iPhone 10, I would say, is just so-so, however. Now, iPhone battery lives have never been ultra impressive, at least in my experience so far, particularly if you're looking at an older phone like this. Make sure that you always try to check out the battery health if you're picking up a used unit. But if you're going refurbished or purchasing a new unit, then that's not something that luckily you have to really worry about. But the 2,700 milliamp hour cell, it will get you through a day's usage. But anything past that will be a bit of a stretch, to be completely honest, and that includes just making calls, watching some videos. Overall, you'll find yourself having to top up pretty much at the end of the day. One other thing that has held up pretty well on iPhones, I would say, is also, despite the fact that it's an AMOLED screen, there have been very few cases of reported screen burn-in, which is just showing that Apple has picked a very high-quality panel on here. Reception quality remains excellent on the iPhone 10, and regardless of if you're making calls via 4G LTE, or if you're browsing the web using Wi-Fi, or using Bluetooth 5.0 to listen to wireless headphones, it all remains tightly connected without any issues. Let's talk about the camera next, which again remains now one of the most central parts of our modern smartphone experience. And luckily, the iPhone X's camera, I would say, is still fairly good, at least the primary 12 megapixel camera. We do have the ability to take portrait shots using that secondary lens there to give you a natural bokeh, and as well as other special effects that you can play around with, including studio lighting that tries to cast kind of a shadow as you are taking your shot, things like contouring. Of course, if you're comparing it with the latest iPhones, you'll see a pretty big leap, particularly in low light situations. There is no dedicated night mode on this phone, so if you are trying to get a lot of nighttime shots done, then that's an area where upgrading to, let's say, the iPhone 11, if not newer, will get you a more significant upgrade. Telephoto lenses on iPhones have never been quite as good as the primary lens in terms of their quality. I personally find it to be a little slower to focus using the telephoto, but overall you can still get some very good shots in terms of the color accuracy. There's certainly no slouch even today, and it will easily outperform many mid-range budget phones in this price range, especially on the Android side for about $200. And of course, video capability has always been an area that iPhones have had overall very consistent performance, particularly in stabilization. Everything is just super smooth, and that definitely is helped by the OIS that's built into this phone. So again, it definitely is still a very serviceable camera, even in today's standards, as you are using it, and it can be definitely something that serves you well just for snapping things to share on social media. Definitely still get some very pleasant looking results using this camera system. Just a few final images here as we zoom in. Again, especially in outdoor environments, it does very well with the colors, saturation, everything does look quite vibrant. You will get better performance, of course, with newer generation phones. That's one area where newer phones will always see an upgrade in, but this is, again, no slouch. Now, speaking of camera, of course, the iPhone X also brought out the kind of controversial Animojis for the very first time, which uses the front-facing camera to track your face. It was somewhat ridiculed at the time, particularly as a selling point on such an expensive phone, but I have to admit it's kind of fun and quirky. Typing remains super comfortable on the screen, even though it's not as large as the latest iPhones, but combined with excellent haptics, along with still a very sensitive display, things are still fast to type on, and again, loading up more complex pages is generally a fast and fluid experience as well. So I can still kind of scroll along, everything is not going to give me any stutters, maybe some elements are still loading here in the background. This is a complex example with lots of videos and ads, but everything still is very responsive as I'm using it. Certainly doesn't become frustrating. Generally speaking, I was able to browse with about 10 tabs open in the browser, and things were still pretty good in terms of hopping back and forth between those tabs. Turning on the volume there, overall takeaways being that the speakers, like I said, are definitely above average because of the stereo separation, and it just sounds a bit more full than I was expecting, to be quite honest. There's a little bit of depth there. You're never going to get a lot of bass on a phone speaker at the end of the day, but it doesn't sound tinny even at higher volume levels, and browsing around feels very fluid and fast without really any stutters that you can detect. Now, as aforementioned, it's no surprise that because it's running on the latest version of iOS 15, there's really no issues in terms of downloading all the latest games, programs, entertainment apps that you commonly use. It all can be installed and runs on here just fine. In fact, you really can't tell a dramatic difference between this and something like the iPhone XS in terms of the performance. Even more demanding titles and games, whether it's Asphalt or PUBG, they can all still run on here just fine. Perhaps it's going to be a little bit slower compared to the latest iPhones in terms of their loading speeds when you are first launching the app, but once you're in there, everything does work generally quite well without much stutters or delays, surprisingly. Of course, if you want to lower some of the graphic settings, you can get even a smoother experience, but that's not always necessary, even on these kind of 3D demanding titles that just are a little bit more taxing on the GPU. So overall, performance on this phone has held up quite well, I have to say, and again, there's nothing from the App Store that you can't play on this device. The only slight remark there is, again, a lot of titles and games which are heavier also will demand more storage space. So keep that in mind as you are looking at the iPhone, since the base capacity model comes in at 64 gigs, and there is no expandable storage ever on iPhones, but there is a 256 gig variant that is also available, but nothing really in between. I would say 64 gigs is still plentiful for most lighter users, especially if you're just snapping some photos, browsing the web, and playing back some occasional traditional games, but if you're someone that is a lot heavier in terms of storing mass amounts of music in addition to playing the heaviest, biggest titles, then you probably will want the bigger capacity variant, but that will also fetch for a little bit higher price. So overall, that is more or less it as far as our revisited look at the iPhone X here in 2022. And overall, I would say the phone has held up better than I was expecting. Particularly, it still is a beautiful constructed phone. The design still looks relatively modern thanks to the fairly minimalistic bezels that was introduced on this phone. The display still is beautiful, and it's a very nice compact form factor. So you can check out more details if you're interested in the links down below. Still is a very usable older iPhone, I have to say, and a pretty iconic one because it introduced this current design language. But for now, that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That's been the iPhone X Revisited.